Welcome back to Holloway Archives. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts across the country who appreciate these forgotten tales of America's hidden past. In the spring of 1961, state surveyors were sent to chart flood risk along an unmapped stretch of Pine Hollow in eastern Kentucky. There, veiled in overgrowth and absent from any official record, they discovered a structure that would haunt investigators for decades to come. The building stood sealed from within, its windows boarded shut with rough planks, the front door fastened with rusted iron spikes driven deep into the threshold. There was no driveway leading to it, no beaten path through the undergrowth, no visible sign that anyone had entered or left the property in decades. When authorities finally gained entry, they found no signs of modern life inside. No electrical wiring snaked through the walls, no plumbing connected the structure to the outside world, no instruments of heat or sound suggested contemporary habitation. Instead, they discovered 11 narrow beds, arranged with deliberate intent throughout 3 sparse rooms, a child's chair bolted permanently to the stone hearth, and behind a false wall concealed with pitch and animal hide, a volume bound in wax and dried blood. The journal's pages were written entirely in reverse, each line flowing from right to left in careful, cramped script. The ink, later confirmed through laboratory analysis to be human blood drawn from multiple sources, had darkened to a rust-brown patina with age. The concentration of iron varied dramatically between entries, suggesting some passages had been written decades apart. There were no proper names anywhere in the text, only sets of initials repeated across generations. No conventional stories filled these pages, only endless repetitions of doctrine and measurement, ritual and refinement. This journal was immediately sealed under state order and would remain hidden from public view for nearly 40 years. The house itself contained no photographs, no birth certificates, no marriage licenses, no death records, and yet census ledgers between 1921 and 1961 consistently listed a single surname repeated across 3 generations, with no mention of spouses, no neighboring family names, and no indication that anyone had ever permanently departed from the isolated property. The doctrine carried within the journal's blood-stained pages was never stated plainly, but its meaning echoed unmistakably. The bloodline must remain clean, pure, and uncontaminated by outside influence, or it must end entirely. This was the guiding principle that governed 40 years of methodical isolation in the hills of eastern Kentucky, 40 years of careful breeding and systematic correction that would ultimately produce something far removed from conventional human experience. It was early spring when the Department of Interior dispatched 2 experienced surveyors to examine a stretch of eastern Kentucky terrain that had long been thought uninhabitable. Comprehensive floodplain assessments were underway along Pine Hollow Creek, where state officials intended to clear new ground for an ambitious dam extension project. The terrain proved challenging from the outset, steep slopes cluttered with dense groves of flowering dogwood and impenetrable bramble thickets that seemed to resist all human passage. The men followed the meandering path of the old creek bed for nearly 2 grueling miles through increasingly difficult terrain, before noticing an unusual rise in the tree line ahead. The elevation change appeared unnaturally geometric, like the stubborn remains of a chimney stack that had somehow refused to collapse, despite decades of neglect and weather. As they drew closer, the structure gradually revealed itself through a thick veil of towering pine and locust trees, wrapped in shadows that seemed to shift and dance even under the bright clarity of full daylight. This mysterious building did not appear on any official parcel map in the county records, nor was it referenced in the comprehensive building ledgers that dated back to 1899. No visible roads of any kind led to the property, no boundary fencing marked its perimeter, and no mailbox or address marker suggested regular postal delivery. The structure simply existed in complete isolation, forgotten by the modern world that had grown up around it. Yet despite its apparent abandonment, The house stood remarkably upright and intact. Its timber frame construction remained sound, though the eaves sagged noticeably under the accumulated weight of thick moss and rotting cedar shingles. A substantial plank of rusted iron had been wedged forcefully across the front entrance, secured in place by 5 heavy iron spikes that had been driven directly through the wood and deep into the stone threshold below. Every window visible from the exterior had been carefully boarded from within, and what little glass remained in the frames had been deliberately blackened with a thick coating of pine pitch. Moss had begun its slow conquest of the structure, creeping up between the warped floorboards of the front porch, which groaned ominously beneath the accumulated weight of decades of neglect. Despite the obvious signs of long abandonment, there were no human footprints visible anywhere around the building, no evidence of soot or ash in the tall stone chimney, and surprisingly, no detectable smell of rot, decay, or human waste that might be expected from such a derelict structure. However, the air surrounding the house possessed an unusual heaviness, a quality that made the younger of the 2 surveyors check his compass repeatedly, as if the magnetic needle might eventually settle in some direction that would restore his sense of reason and orientation. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on both men as they began their methodical examination of the property. They circled the structure in complete silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. The rear of the house offered no secondary entrance, presenting instead a sheer drop into a treacherous ravine filled with twisted scrub brush and jagged limestone outcroppings. A single wooden shutter was notably missing from one of the upstairs windows, and the frame suggested it had been torn away from the inside with considerable violence. On the eastern wall of the structure, a bare spot in the otherwise complete covering of ivy revealed the weathered remnants of a symbol that had once been carved directly into the wooden siding. The marking appeared to be a simple circle intersected by a precise X, and beneath this geometric design they discovered the clear outline of a child's small palm print pressed into the wood as if the hand had been dipped in some dark substance before being pressed against the wall with deliberate force. That evening, the 2 surveyors filed their official report using a manual typewriter at a local roadside lodge. The older and more experienced of the 2 men made no mention whatsoever of the mysterious house in his formal submission to the state agency. However, the younger surveyor felt compelled to include additional documentation. He enclosed a detailed hand-drawn sketch of the structure, along with a brief annotation scribbled in the margin of his report. Unmapped structure, sealed with iron spikes, no visible signs of entry or exit. Extremely cold interior temperature. The word cold had been underlined twice with heavy pencil strokes. Several weeks passed before any official action was taken regarding this discovery. It was only after a second investigative team, this time dispatched from the State Historic Preservation Office, insisted on personally verifying the reported anomaly, that a more formal and comprehensive investigation finally began. The new team was accompanied by 2 uniformed officers from the county Sheriff's Department as a precautionary measure. They returned to the site on a still morning in early June. The heavy front door was finally pried open just before noon, under a sky so motionless and oppressive that one of the accompanying officers remarked, half in jest, that the clouds themselves seemed to be holding their breath in anticipation of what might be discovered within. Inside, the house was completely intact and undisturbed by time or intruders. 11 iron-framed beds stood arranged throughout 3 separate rooms, with 6 positioned on the ground floor and 5 more in the upper level. Each mattress had been methodically stripped down to its basic ticking, with no linens, pillows, or personal belongings of any kind remaining. In the kitchen area, the large stone hearth had been carefully filled with dried mud and small twigs, though forensic examination revealed no evidence that any of this material had ever been burned or used for actual heating. A heavy wooden high chair had been permanently bolted to the floor, directly beside the fireplace. The chair's feeding tray was severely warped and darkened by some unknown substance that clearly was not the result of normal aging or use. Throughout the entire house, every mirror had been deliberately removed from the walls. Even the small finishing nails that had once secured them in place showed clear evidence of having been wrenched out with considerable and deliberate force. In the master bedroom, investigators discovered that a massive wooden dresser had been pushed against the small closet door, completely blocking access to the interior space. When the heavy piece of furniture was finally moved aside, the closet door revealed a crude false panel that had been attached with pine pitch and irregular strips of what appeared to be animal hide. Behind this makeshift barrier, buried carefully in a mixture of dried straw and hardened wax, lay a thick leather-bound volume that would become the centerpiece of the entire investigation. The book's cover bore no title, author's name, or publication information of any kind. Its pages had been sealed together with a reddish resin that had hardened over time into an almost impenetrable barrier. When the volume was finally opened days later by trained state archivists working under controlled conditions, they discovered that the entire text had been written in complete reverse, with cramped and curved lettering flowing from right to left across every page. The handwriting appeared to be the work of a single individual, though careful analysis revealed subtle changes in pressure and stroke width that suggested multiple authors had contributed to the text over an extended period. Laboratory analysis conducted weeks later confirmed investigators' suspicions about the unusual ink used throughout the journal. It was indeed human blood, drawn from several different individuals and applied at various concentrations that indicated the entries had been made across many years or even decades. The iron content varied significantly from page to page, with some sections appearing much darker and more heavily saturated than others. No photographs of any kind were discovered anywhere in the house. There were no documents establishing ownership or legal occupation of the property, no evidence of electrical wiring or indoor plumbing, and no modern conveniences of any description. The only paper materials found on the premises were the mysterious journal itself, a severely damaged hymnal with all even-numbered pages torn out completely, and a 1938 Farmer's Almanac that had been extensively defaced, with scratch marks trailing off into completely illegible spirals. The basement door had been sealed shut with a thick wooden beam that had been nailed in place on both sides of the frame, creating an impenetrable barrier. Several attempts to open this door without compromising the structural integrity of the building ultimately failed, and no further excavation or exploration of the basement level was ever officially authorized by the investigating agencies. Despite extensive research into county records, birth registries, and census data, there was absolutely no documentation indicating that the family had ever formally departed from the property. The official records simply showed that they had stopped being counted in local surveys and registrations, as if they had gradually faded from administrative existence rather than actually relocating to another area. The house was quietly reclassified as a structural hazard and permanently sealed once more, this time by direct order of the state government. The recovered journal was immediately placed in restricted storage, where it would remain until 1998, when legal jurisdiction was transferred to a university archive system and the documents were re-examined under newly established psychological ethics protocols. However, even among the professional investigators, the state-appointed historians, and the academic researchers who were granted limited access to the materials over the years, there remained one detail about which no consensus could ever be reached. The fundamental question that continued to divide expert opinion was whether the house had originally been constructed to keep unwanted people out of the family's private world, or whether it had been designed to keep something far more sinister safely contained within its walls. The journal was not unearthed by professional archaeologists following established scientific procedures, but rather discovered entirely by circumstance during the routine investigation. It had been carefully wedged behind the false panel that was no broader than a child's shoulder span, sealed within multiple layers of blackened wax, and wrapped in aged linen that still bore the clear imprint of a human hand pressed into the fabric. The protective wax had deteriorated significantly over time, flaking away at the corners and clinging to the first pages of the journal like some form of organic decay. The bound volume weighed considerably more than would be expected for a book of its apparent size. When the journal was first opened under sterile lighting conditions at the State Records Facility in Frankfurt, the reversed, Writing initially appeared completely illegible to the investigating team. It was only when a young intern held one of the pages up to a mirror that the true meaning began to emerge from the cryptic symbols. The entire book had been written in perfect reverse script, flowing from right to left in the curling strokes characteristic of penmanship manuals from the early 1900s. The ink consistency varied dramatically throughout the volume, appearing too dark and concentrated in some sections, while seeming dried and faded in others. When subjected to comprehensive laboratory analysis, the writing medium tested positive for hemoglobin and other blood proteins. Further testing identified the substance as human blood that had been sourced from at least 3 distinct individuals, based on variations in cellular composition and genetic markers. The concentration of iron and other minerals varied significantly by individual entries, providing strong evidence that some passages had been written years or even decades apart from others. Throughout the entire journal, there were no proper names written in any of the margins, no formal titles or specific dates beyond small sets of recurring initials. The most common abbreviations were MER, MJR, and a distinctive monogram that appeared more frequently than any other marking. This particular symbol, resembling 2 interlocked letter L's, was invariably written larger and with greater flourishes than the other notations, suggesting it held special significance within the family's private system of identification. The individual entries were not composed as conventional letters, personal reflections, or diary-style observations. Instead, they read like carefully structured instructions, quiet manifestos, and ritualistic guidelines passed down from one generation to the next. Some passages resembled religious hymns in their repetitive cadence and devotional tone, while others appeared to be detailed genealogical records, though the format gradually dissolved into increasingly cryptic lists of births, paired with enigmatic phrases such as retained, corrected, or folded out. None of the entries provided any description of daily life activities, seasonal changes, agricultural work, or weather patterns. There were no references to external events, political developments, or social interactions with neighbors or the broader community. Instead, the pages read like conversations that turned perpetually inward, ritualistic reminders spoken from one generation to the next, as if no member of the family had ever truly left the confines of the house or experienced life beyond its sealed walls. One particularly disturbing entry that forensic analysis dated to approximately 1923 described in clinical detail the cleansing of a mind corrupted by outer talk. Another passage, written in noticeably smaller handwriting, referred to the second child born right-blooded, followed by a series of detailed notes concerning posture, enforced silence, and teeth that clench too soon in development. Throughout the journal, physical characteristics and anatomical features were consistently referenced as moral and spiritual concerns rather than simple medical observations. Narrow hip measurements, fused toe conditions, and precise eye alignment were discussed with the detached tone of a livestock breeder evaluating desirable traits in animals. The corrections described in these passages were neither conventional medical treatments nor traditional spiritual interventions. They appeared to be genealogical manipulations, designed to refine and purify the family bloodline across successive generations. Significantly, no outside family names ever appeared anywhere in the text. The family's world was completely self-contained, with no acknowledgement of marriages, partnerships, or relationships extending beyond their immediate bloodline. A separate section that had been added to the journal between the original stitched binding consisted of what appeared to be lambskin vellum that had been glued into the spine at a slight angle, suggesting it was a later addition to the original volume. The text in this supplementary section was notably more erratic than the earlier entries. Individual letters doubled back on themselves in confused loops, syntax collapsed into fragments, and complete sentences became increasingly rare. However, one line stood out from the surrounding chaos, written in a more deliberate stroke, and mirrored in larger script than anything else in the journal. The left-handed ones can't be taught. Burn their names. Bind the mouths. Through careful analysis of repetition patterns and marginal notations, it became apparent to researchers that the recurring initials might not have represented individual names at all, but rather specific roles or perhaps designated locations within the family's complex internal hierarchy. The abbreviation M appeared most frequently near detailed anatomical sketches and measurements. JR was invariably followed by specific dates and references to corrections or modifications. The dominant LL symbol was most often positioned at both the beginning and end of individual entries, as if marking both authorship and final approval of the contents. Forensic handwriting analysis revealed that the pressure applied by the writing instrument deepened progressively with each successive generation represented in the journal. The later entries actually tore slightly through the paper surface, as if they had been written by increasingly unsteady or malformed hands that could no longer control the writing pressure effectively. By 1959, the written language had deteriorated into glyph-like shapes that maintained the reversed orientation but were completely devoid of coherent meaning. Even among professional cryptographers and linguistic specialists who were granted access to these final pages, the last two entries resisted all attempts at interpretation. The patterns vaguely resembled fetal silhouettes drawn in triplicate arrangements, but their precise meaning remained elusive. The very final line of the journal had been sealed with a pressed thumbprint in dried blood, creating a dark seal smaller than a silver dollar. When this marking was finally deciphered through mirror reflection, it revealed a phrase that immediately silenced the entire reviewing panel. "We were not meant to bend outward." Following this discovery, the journal was immediately resealed under medical ethics restrictions and would remain completely inaccessible for nearly 40 additional years. Those few investigators, archivists, and researchers who had been granted direct access to handle the volume during the initial examination period reported experiencing significantly more than routine professional unease while working with the materials. One senior archivist resigned from her position just 3 weeks after completing the cataloging process, citing persistent sleep difficulties and recurring nausea that had begun immediately after her exposure to the journal's contents. She later described experiencing vivid, recurring dreams of a windowless room where children sat back-to-back in perfect silence, scribbling continuously with their left hands in absolute unison, though none of the figures ever made any audible sound during these dream sequences. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the observation made by several handwriting experts that despite the apparent changes in age, physical strength, and clarity of script across the 40-year span represented in the journal, the fundamental writing style never deviated in any measurable way. The characteristic letter formations, spacing, and stroke patterns remained remarkably consistent, as though the original hand that had begun the journal in the early 1920s had somehow never truly died, but continued to guide each successive writer across the decades. The earliest entries in the blood-written journal carried a peculiar formality that suggested the writer considered himself a careful steward, rather than merely a subject of the process he was documenting. These opening passages did not begin with family names, traditional prayers, or even basic location information. Instead, they opened with a single phrase that was written again and again in reversed script and heavily underlined for emphasis, "Only the clean shall multiply." This central phrase recurred across numerous pages throughout the journal, each repetition flanked by sets of initials and complex markings that later researchers would compare to the detailed breeding charts more commonly encountered in livestock management logs than in conventional human record-keeping systems. Despite the obvious religious overtones of some terminology, there were absolutely no references to God, divine intervention, biblical covenant, or spiritual redemption anywhere in the text. The doctrine preserved within these blood-stained pages was not theological or spiritual in nature. It was purely anatomical and biological. The preservation of what the journal referred to only as the line was described in stark, clinical terms that would not be out of place in a scientific breeding manual. Physical traits to be systematically amplified, genetic defects to be ruthlessly culled, precise measurements of hair color, spine length, and facial symmetry, were all discussed with the cold precision of a trained eugenicist, though no external scientific sources or authorities were ever cited as references. The specialized knowledge contained within the journal appeared to be entirely self-contained and self-generating, reinforced only through endless repetition and sealed with human blood. A key passage that forensic analysis dated to the early 1920s, based on ink degradation patterns, detailed a reproductive pairing between two individuals who were both marked with identical monograms. LL plus LL yields second formation. No deviation in dental structure. Breathes evenly through nose. No speech impediment or stammer. No actual names were provided for these individuals. No emotional reflection or personal commentary was included, and the tone remained completely mechanical and clinical. This cold, scientific approach was relieved only by a brief marginal note written in slightly different handwriting. The line remains narrow. Narrow is strong. This phrase would become something of a recurring motto throughout the later portions of the journal, appearing whenever successful breeding results were documented. As the entries progressed through the decades, this ideological framework expanded to include detailed behavioral criteria alongside the physical measurements. A child who sang softly before falling asleep was described as unripe and marked for further observation. Another child who consistently refused to eat boiled root vegetables was listed with the clinical term excised, though no context was provided to explain what this excision process actually entailed. The presence of blood traces between these particular pages suggested that something had been physically marked, redacted, or perhaps permanently removed from the family structure. The philosophical system that gradually emerged through these cryptic entries was fundamentally based on containment and concentration, rather than growth and expansion. The breeding program was not designed to welcome new genetic material from outside sources, but rather to systematically refine the existing family stock through generation after generation of careful selection, until the bloodline achieved what the journal repeatedly referred to as lineal perfection. What modern anthropological science might classify as dangerous genetic bottlenecking was framed within the journal as a form of spiritual ascension. According to this twisted logic, the fewer the genetic variables introduced into the breeding process, the fewer the potential flaws in the resulting offspring. The fewer the flaws that appeared in each generation, the closer the family line moved toward the ultimate goal of what they called lineal perfection. By the 1940s, individual journal entries began to suggest a significant loss of cohesion in the traditional household structure that had apparently governed the earlier decades. Multiple birth records were logged within the same calendar year, sometimes occurring within just weeks of one another. Rather than listing the mothers as separate individuals, the journal marked each birth with a mysterious glyph that resembled an eye that had been crossed out with a single harsh stroke. The fathers of these children were never identified by name, initial, or even basic physical description. One particularly cryptic entry noted, "The seed corrects, the womb adapts. All forms are retested." Whether these words reflected genuine belief, resigned acceptance, or the onset of collective madness remained unclear to the researchers who attempted to interpret their meaning. As time progressed, the doctrine's language grew increasingly cold and detached from normal human emotion or experience. Clinical descriptions such as spine lengthening successful, cleft palate reduced, and digits evened completely replaced any mention of love, marital union, or even basic biological processes. Sexual reproduction was never described as a physical act between two individuals. Instead, it was referred to only through the euphemistic term folding, while those individuals deemed genetically unfit for reproduction were marked with single letters, F, D, or S. Among the various archivists and researchers who gained access to these materials over the decades, the precise meaning of these letter classifications remained uncertain and hotly debated. The most commonly accepted theories ranged from failed to disposed to something far older and more ritualistic that might have its roots in pre-Christian folk practices of the Appalachian region. There was one moment in a torn and partially legible passage dated 1953 where the writer, possibly the last person to contribute to the journal, appeared to hesitate in their usual clinical documentation. A brief line written in noticeably shakier handwriting read, "The mirror forgets who first looked into it." This page ended abruptly in mid-sentence, and the next entry began immediately with a return to the familiar pattern of measurements and clinical observations. What became increasingly clear through the accumulated silence, the consistently sterile tone, and the meticulous record-keeping was that the gradual collapse of this family was not the result of some spontaneous decay or unfortunate accident. It had been deliberately chosen, carefully overseen, and methodically repeated across multiple generations. The biological and social collapse was not accidental or unavoidable. It had been ritualized, actively sought after, and pursued with religious devotion. Most disturbing of all, the doctrine itself, rather than breaking down under the accumulated weight of obvious madness and genetic damage, appeared to have calcified over time into a kind of sacred logic that could justify any action or result. No individual names were ever written in the journal, no personal individuality was acknowledged or celebrated, and no deviation from the established pattern was tolerated. The underlying conviction that drove everything was simple. The purer the blood became through systematic inbreeding, the less recognizably human it needed to remain. Between the years of 1890 and 1921, the family surname appeared regularly and unremarkably across church ledgers, school enrollment forms, and county marriage records throughout eastern Kentucky. Historical research revealed that the family attended a local Baptist chapel twice per month with reasonable consistency, tithed modest amounts to support the congregation, and recorded their births and deaths in conventional ink like all their neighbors. Contemporary witnesses, who were still alive decades later, recalled the family members as notably quiet and slow to speak in social situations, but they were nevertheless present and accounted for in community activities. They contributed hand-woven baskets to winter charity gatherings, occupied their regular seats in the back pew during Sunday services, and were consistently counted in local census surveys and voting rolls. However, after 1921, the family name vanished completely from all public congregations and community records. The final mention in the church ledger was a baptism entry for an infant whose name was only partially legible due to water damage or deliberate defacement. The entry was marked with an unusual note from the officiating minister, referencing what he described as a disagreement over godparent selection. The minister's handwriting became noticeably less steady toward the end of this entry, and the ink appeared to have been applied with excessive pressure, as if the writer had been agitated or distressed. The following week's page in the church ledger continued with completely unrelated names and routine church business, as if nothing unusual had occurred. No formal departure from the congregation was ever recorded, no official excommunication proceedings were documented, and no illness or relocation notice was filed with church authorities. The family had simply, in the span of a single season, withdrawn completely from all public religious participation and community involvement. Yet county census records told a significantly different and more puzzling story. In 1930, the federal enumeration process listed exactly 5 individuals residing at the Pine Hollow property. By 1940, this number had mysteriously increased to 9 residents. The 1950 census recorded 11 people living on the isolated property, all apparently sharing the same family surname. However, no occupations were listed for any of these individuals, no educational attainment levels were recorded, and no known languages were noted in the official documentation. In every decade of census counting, the household's primary respondent was consistently recorded as unavailable for direct interview. The census taker was forced to mark all demographic information as inferred by neighbor testimony, though comprehensive research revealed that none of the nearest homesteads were located within 2 miles of the Pine Hollow property, making direct observation of the family's activities virtually impossible. The most curious and unsettling detail lay in the pattern of surname repetition across the decades. Each census entry carried the same family surname without any variation or deviation. However, the first names listed for the various individuals were all variations of the same few basic initials, R, M, L. These, Letters were reordered, reduplicated, and sometimes reversed in different combinations. One child was listed as LML, another as Mr., followed by a hand-scrolled note that read, "Same as above, but younger." Official school board minutes from 1925 contained a reference to a mandatory district visit to the family estate. A county clerk who had been assigned to encourage rural enrollment compliance noted in his report that the children were observed only behind glass windows, and that he was denied entry into the home by an adult woman who spoke as if echoing words from somewhere else. No children from the Pine Hollow household were ever registered in any district school system following this visit. The state birth registry provided further disturbing anomalies that defied conventional explanation. Although names appeared for births in each census decade, there was absolutely no record of maternal identity after 1924. From that point forward, the same surname was listed for both mother and father in all birth registrations. In some cases, the mother's information field was left entirely blank, while in others, only the single initial L appeared in the space designated for maternal identification. While it was not uncommon in that remote region, especially during the war years, for extended families to raise children communally or off the grid, the complete absence of external names or marriage records created growing suspicion among county officials. However, suspicion alone did not constitute evidence of criminal activity, and the family's consistent refusal to engage with outside authorities was not technically illegal. What deepened the sense of unease among local officials was the absolute consistency of the pattern, the systematic refusal to allow the family lineage to fracture even once through normal marriage or adoption practices. Across 40 years of documentation, 11 recorded births, and multiple generations of residents, there were no marriages to individuals from other families, no outside surnames introduced into the lineage, and no death certificates ever issued for anyone residing on the Pine Hollow property. An anonymous letter dated 1956 and filed among the county clerk's miscellaneous correspondence referred to children who could be observed walking along the same path at precisely the same hour each day. The unknown author described watching these figures through distant brush and trees, noting that the children wore identical clothing and never spoke to each other during these daily walks. The letter ended abruptly with an observation that would haunt local officials for years. "I thought one was a mirror reflection until it blinked independently." By 1961, when the sealed house was finally uncovered and systematically surveyed by state investigators, absolutely no neighbors admitted to having any knowledge of the property's current residents. The isolated structure had acquired the local nickname the Hush House among area residents, though no one could remember who had originally coined this term or when it had first begun circulating. What remained inside the house when it was finally opened suggested decades of complete continuity without any external contact, elaborate ritual practices without interruption, and a family bloodline that had been sustained without any infusion of outside genetic material. This was a private world that had been systematically looping in on itself generation after generation, like an intricate clockwork mechanism that had been designed to turn perpetually inward. The complete absence of outsiders from the family's reproductive and social systems was clearly not accidental or the result of mere geographic isolation. It had been deliberately engineered and carefully maintained across multiple decades. The children born into this sealed environment, if they could still be properly called children, were not born into the conventional world at all. They had been systematically constructed to remain forever outside normal human society, existing in a parallel realm governed by laws and logic that bore no resemblance to the external world that surrounded their hidden sanctuary. Among the most deeply unsettling patterns to emerge from detailed analysis of the sealed journal was not simply the repetition of names and initials or the bizarre mirrored writing system, but rather the gradual compression of time intervals between births and the blurring of traditional generational roles. The earliest genealogical entries suggested a loosely structured but recognizable household organization during the years immediately following the Great War, with adults and children clearly distinguished by age, responsibility, and social function. The reproductive pairings documented in these early entries, while already confined exclusively to individuals sharing a single surname, still acknowledged the conventional differences between age groups and generational hierarchy. References appeared to uncles raising nieces, cousins providing assistance during childbirth, and other traditional extended family arrangements that would have been familiar to any rural community of that era. However, by the early 1930s, this organizational structure began to deteriorate in ways that defied conventional understanding. Journal entries began listing reproductive pairings not by recognizable names or traditional family relationships, but rather by cryptic initials matched to specific birth markings and physical characteristics. Typical entries read like genetic formulas: LLR plus MRL, spiral birthmark plus freckled formation, or first fold plus soft palate configuration. One particularly disturbing entry read, M plus M, ears aligned symmetrically, equals R, completely void of speech. These were clearly not romantic or affectionate descriptions of family relationships. They read more like mathematical formulas or breeding calculations, with reproductive pairings being systematically repeated, adjusted based on results, and then logged again with detailed remarks concerning symmetry, bone structure, or reactions to light and sound. The time intervals between these calculated reproductive events began to shorten dramatically as the decades progressed. Children, who had once been born years apart, began appearing in the household within months of each other. In some disturbing cases, identical monograms were assigned to multiple birth records within a single calendar year, leading archivists to suspect not clerical duplication, but rather the complete absence of traditional generational distinctions. It remained unclear exactly when the concept of age-based hierarchy ceased to matter within the family's internal doctrine, but by the 1940s, the journal entries no longer referenced lineage, ancestry, or generational descent at all. Instead, they focused entirely on similarity, replication, and what they termed corrective reproduction. Infants were clinically described as well-mirrored, complete improvement over previous version, or held longer inside, shows superior results. The disturbing implication that emerged from these entries was that the children were not simply close relatives reproducing within a limited gene pool, but rather deliberate reflections and recreations of existing genetic stock. The reproductive process was not producing new individuals, but rather creating repetitions of carefully selected blood characteristics, not through random biological chance, but through systematic design and intention. University observers who were granted extremely limited access to specific journal pages in 1999 noted how certain birth entries were described as, quote, corrective procedures, as though each new generation was consciously attempting to undo the small failures and imperfections of the previous. One birth record was clinically marked excess digits surgically removed. Another entry read, maintains sitting posture before speech development, excellent postural control. Far more troubling were the detailed anatomical sketches that had been drawn throughout the journal in coarse ink, usually oriented in the same reversed direction as the written text. These outline drawings displayed an uncanny, symmetrical precision that seemed to transcend normal human variation. When the sketched faces were turned upright using mirror reflection, they revealed matching eye placement, identically narrow chin lines, and a particular curvature of the spine that remained completely consistent across more than 20 years of documented entries. The children depicted in these later sketches did not simply resemble their biological parents in the normal way that family genetics might predict. Instead, they appeared to be systematically becoming identical to them through some process that defied natural reproduction. One investigating researcher remarked that the progression of portraits seemed to double backward on themselves, creating reflections of reflections, as if each successive generation was becoming a progressively paler and more distorted replica of the previous one. This phenomenon closely resembled a documented concept in closed population biology known as generational mirroring, where specific genetic traits begin to compound not in a linear progression forward through time, but rather in recursive loops that fold back on themselves. When no external genetic variables are available to disrupt these repetitive patterns, individual identity itself eventually collapses into pure repetition. There was no indication anywhere in the journal that these children understood their position as unique individuals. In fact, a 1951 entry stated matter-of-factly that the new M speaks exactly as old M did without any prompting or instruction. Another entry from later in the same year described a child who recognized herself perfectly in a mirror but displayed no reaction of surprise or curiosity, suggesting not confusion about identity, but rather complete expectation that such recognition would occur naturally. By the final decade represented in the journal, the writing became increasingly erratic and difficult to decipher. Individual pages warped with accumulated moisture, ink faded and smeared across entire sections, and the handwriting itself stiffened into mechanical repetition. However, one phrase appeared consistently across 5 separate entries, written each time at the top margin before any new birth was described: "Let them not pass, but loop." The concept of generational progression in any traditional sense had completely ceased to exist within this family structure. The bloodline no longer moved forward through time in normal biological succession. Instead, it had begun folding systematically inward on itself, creating an endless cycle of genetic and behavioral repetition that seemed to operate outside normal temporal boundaries. The children produced by this system, if they could still be called children in any meaningful sense, did not appear to be products of natural time and development, but rather deliberate constructions designed according to precise specifications. They were not born from love, instinct, or even basic reproductive drive, but rather assembled through cold obsession and systematic manipulation, as if some guiding intelligence was shaping them toward a final, unblinking image of perfection. What that ultimate image was intended to represent was never explicitly stated in any of the journal entries, only that the family believed they were moving steadily closer to its complete realization with each successive generation. Among the many disturbing pages contained within the sealed journal, archivists discovered a series of entries that were distinctly different from all the rest, written in handwriting that was noticeably smaller, more delicate, and yet unnervingly precise in its execution. The individual pen strokes were fine and controlled. The ink appeared lighter than in previous sections, as though the writing had been produced by much younger fingers working with careful deliberation. However, it was not the apparent age of the handwriting that drew the most attention from researchers. It was the perfect orientation of the text. Unlike the earlier journal entries, which had been painstakingly reversed, with obvious intent, but still showed the gradual degradation of pressure and stability that would be expected from adults learning an unnatural writing system. These newer passages were composed in flawlessly executed mirrored cursive script. All of the letter formations that typically betray a child's uncertainty in developing handwriting skills were completely absent from these entries. Loop height remained perfectly consistent. Baseline alignment never varied, and spacing between letters and words was maintained with mechanical precision. The handwriting was not merely copied backward through careful effort, but appeared to have been originally composed in reverse orientation, as if the young writer had never learned to write in any other direction. Linguistic scholars who were granted access to review the journal noted that this distinctive writing pattern first began appearing around 1946. One entry, which appeared to be a lesson transcription designed for educational purposes, listed the entire English alphabet in complete reverse order, followed by detailed phonetic instructions, also written in reverse, explaining how each letter should be properly pronounced aloud. This instructional sequence was repeated 3 separate times on the same page, then signed with a single initial in the same flowing backward script. Significantly, there were no forward-facing entries of any kind anywhere in the journal after this point in the chronological sequence. The clear implication was deeply unsettling to researchers. These children were not learning to correct or mirror an existing conventional language system that they had previously mastered. Instead, they had been systematically raised from birth inside a completely reversed linguistic world. The journal itself, rather than serving as some kind of cipher or code that needed to be decoded by outsiders, had apparently become the only form of written communication that these children had ever known or experienced. They were not translating between 2 different writing systems, but rather living entirely within a single reversed reality that had no connection to the external world. A loose sheet of paper, tucked carefully between pages near the end of the book, contained what appeared to be a complete short story written in the same fluid backward script. The narrative began with a child awakening in a dark room that contained a window showing no view of any outside landscape. The child methodically counted the corners of the room, finding 4 at first, then 3 during a second count, and finally none at all during a third examination. The story ended abruptly with a single line that, when translated through mirror reflection, read, "The mouth is learning not to speak." Below this final sentence was a small fingerprint pressed into the paper using blood, creating a mark smaller than a coin but clearly visible under proper lighting conditions. Language within the family's private doctrinal system was never intended to facilitate communication with the outside world. Instead, it functioned as a completely closed loop, a self-referencing communication system designed exclusively to transmit internal rules and behavioral expectations to those individuals who had been born into the bloodline. If any child demonstrated the ability to write in conventional forward-facing script, they were immediately considered misformed and marked for correction. If children asked to read their lessons aloud in a normal voice, they were marked with the letter S in the journal's margins. This particular letter classification appeared frequently throughout the later entries, but significantly, it never appeared twice beside the same set of identifying initials. The clear implication was that children who received this marking did not remain within the household structure for very long. A brief anecdote recorded in a surviving field journal, written by a county clerk who had assisted in the 1961 investigation, described discovering a single page that had been pinned to the wall above one of the attic beds. The page was framed with rough twine that had been crudely stitched directly into the wooden wall paneling, and it contained only one line of text written in the characteristic reversed script. The clerk painstakingly mirrored the text by hand and deciphered it as reading, "Pure as thee." However, it was the handwriting itself that disturbed him most profoundly during the transcription process. The script appeared too symmetrical and controlled, too mechanically steady to have been produced by human hand, displaying a pattern of letter formation that contained no errors, variations, or natural inconsistencies. In his personal notes, the clerk later wrote that the handwriting looked printed rather than written, but somehow pulsing with organic rhythm. This observation would prove to be remarkably prescient, as later analysis would reveal similar mechanical precision in handwriting samples throughout the journal. There are established theories among linguistic anthropologists that prolonged exposure to mirrored script systems can produce measurable effects on cognitive development and brain function. When individuals are required to process visual input that consistently flows in reverse direction, the brain gradually adjusts not only to the immediate visual information, but also to the underlying logical structure that governs the reversed system. Direction, sequence, and even fundamental time perception can begin to distort when the mind becomes fully adapted to reversed linguistic input. Mirrored writing is not simply a curious novelty or harmless mental exercise. When this reversed orientation is learned during critical early childhood development, it can completely replace conventional cognitive structures and thought patterns. By the final pages of the journal, several entries appeared less like recognizable text and more like abstract symbols arranged in complex patterns. These markings consisted of looped, mirrored sigils that did not correspond to any known alphabet system, whether English, European, or ancient. The penmanship remained meticulous and controlled throughout these symbolic entries, but their meaning was completely lost to conventional interpretation. The disturbing implication was that the children had begun to independently invent new forms of language that served their own internal communication needs, not for purposes of secrecy or rebellion against adult authority, but simply because they had no memory or knowledge of any alternative communication system. Their reversed world had become so complete and self-contained that they were beginning to evolve beyond the need for any connection to external reality. The last line that could be definitively attributed to a child's handwriting was etched into the margin of a torn sheet near the very end of the journal. This entry was unique in that it represented the only text in the entire volume that had been written both forward and backward on the same page, suggesting some kind of internal conflict or confusion in the young writer. When the reversed portion was translated through mirror reflection, it read clearly, "I will become the voice." However, the forward-facing version written directly beneath this statement consisted of nothing but meaningless patterns and repetitive marks that trailed off until the ink supply was completely exhausted. In the spring of 1944, a routine clerical review conducted at the Breathitt County Records Office uncovered a significant administrative inconsistency in the official birth registry, an anomaly that would remain uncorrected and unexplained for the next 70 years. The discovery revealed that 5 separate infants had been registered under the same household address, all within an impossibly compressed span of 11 months. Each individual listing carried the identical family surname, and each birth had allegedly occurred at the same remote address, a hillside property located on Pine Hollow Creek that had long been assumed vacant by county officials and local residents alike. What made these registry entries most peculiar was not the timing or the shared location, but rather the names themselves, or more accurately, the complete absence of meaningful name distinction. Each of the 5 children had been officially registered with identical initials, LL. The middle initials showed only slight variation, alternating between R, M, and in one particularly odd case, the Arabic numeral 3. No complete given names were provided anywhere in the documentation. No mothers were identified by name or initial, and no fathers were listed in the appropriate fields. Every entry bore the same bureaucratic notation, reported by resident, a standard administrative term used when a household refused to allow external medical examination or official verification of birth circumstances. The ink used to complete all 5 registry entries appeared to match in age and chemical composition, but forensic analysis revealed significant variations in pen pressure between individual entries, strongly suggesting that all 5 births had been recorded simultaneously rather than in chronological sequence as they supposedly occurred. When these birth records were cross-referenced against official death registries for the same time period, no matching infant mortality records could be located anywhere in the county system. None of these 5 children were ever recorded again in any official capacity. There were no baptismal records, no school enrollment forms, no marriage licenses, and no subsequent birth or death certificates bearing their names or initials. It appeared as though these 5 individuals had been born for the sole purpose of being counted in official records, then immediately folded back into the isolated household where they disappeared completely from all external documentation and observation. The mysterious journal recovered 17 years later contained cryptic references to this same critical year in the family's development. One page that bore 1944, written in the margin and signed with the same LL initials that appeared on the birth certificates, contained a detailed mirrored diagram that seemed to provide some explanation for the administrative confusion. The diagram showed 5 circles arranged in a perfect vertical line, each one labeled with identical symbols. Next to each circle was a brief notation written in the characteristic reversed script: held breath, stilled blink, returned clean, returned folded, and simply returned. No additional details or explanations accompanied this cryptic sketch, though the entire page was marred with a dense, rust-colored stain that later laboratory analysis confirmed contained dried human blood mixed with organic tissue fragments consistent with umbilical cord material. Nowhere in the journal were there any direct references to multiple births, twin deliveries, or other explanations for the simultaneous appearance of multiple infants. However, later in the chronological sequence, a single line appeared beneath another child's registration that read, "Born among 5, kept as 1." A former census supervisor who was interviewed decades later during a follow-up investigation recalled how the Pine Hollow property had been flagged for additional inspection due to persistent inconsistencies in reported birth rates that didn't align with observable household composition. A formal letter was sent to the property requesting official confirmation of family structure and current resident count, but this correspondence was never answered or acknowledged. When a field agent was finally dispatched to the property during the early winter of 1944, he reported experiencing a complete absence of detectable noise from within the house structure. He noted that smoke was clearly visible rising from the chimney, indicating active habitation, but no sounds of human movement, conversation, or daily activity could be heard from anywhere around the building. The agent knocked twice on the front door and received no response. However, while waiting for some acknowledgement of his presence, he observed what he believed to be a child's face appearing briefly behind the wooden slats that had been nailed across one of the ground floor windows. The pale, narrow features matched exactly with a photograph that had been submitted weeks earlier, along with one of the 1944 birth certificate applications. The child's face blinked once, with deliberate slowness, then withdrew from view. A few moments later, a second face appeared in the same location, followed by a third, then a fourth. All of the faces appeared essentially identical in terms of bone structure, coloring, and expression, displaying the same pale complexion and unnaturally narrow features. The field agent returned the following morning accompanied by another census official for additional verification, but by that time, all of the windows had been covered entirely with thick pine pitch, making any interior observation completely impossible. The property was subsequently marked as non-compliant rather than hostile, and no further official visits were ever authorized by county authorities. Whether the 5 entries in the 1944 birth registry represented 5 distinct children, or a single child whose information had been duplicated through administrative error, remained a subject of intense archival debate for decades. Some researchers suggested that the multiple entries reflected some form of ritualistic naming, the ceremony, a deliberate obfuscation of individual identity designed to preserve ancestral continuity while confusing outside authorities. Others proposed a far more disturbing explanation, that the children were indeed 5 separate individuals who had been systematically bred to be physically identical and functionally interchangeable, trained from birth to replace one another without any external detection or interruption of the family's secretive activities. The journal itself offered no definitive clarification on this critical question. The only additional information was a final line written in reverse script at the bottom of the blood-stained page. No one will know which one saw the sun. Toward the latter half of the journal, in sections where the ink had begun to fade significantly, and the previously precise mirrored text was giving way to increasingly erratic and uncontrolled handwriting, there appeared a single entry that stood apart from all the rest. This passage, dated 1957 according to marginal notation, represented the only page in the entire volume that was not signed with the usual collection of monograms, anatomical symbols, or family initials. Instead, this entry was marked only with the phrase, "last clean one," written in handwriting that was noticeably hesitant and uncertain. The script lacked the mechanical precision found in earlier entries and the confident symmetry that characterized the writing of children who had been raised from birth to reverse their relationship with the normal world. Individual letters leaned inconsistently in different directions, as if the writer had been forced to consciously unlearn something that had once been fundamental to their identity. The overall appearance of this handwriting resembled someone attempting to speak in a language they no longer believed in or fully understood. This voice, though faint and uncertain, represented the first clear break in the long pattern of ritual obedience and doctrinal reinforcement that had characterized the journal for decades. Rather than reinforcing the established breeding doctrine or celebrating successful corrections and refinements, this anonymous writer began by admitting a profound sense of confusion about their role and identity within the family structure. The confusion was not emotional or guilt-ridden, not characterized by error or rebellion, but rather represented a quiet, calculated assessment of circumstances that no longer made logical sense. "The others move in rhythm," the page read, "but it is not my rhythm. They speak my name, but not with mouths that belong to them." This observation suggested that the writer had begun to notice that the other family members were operating according to behavioral patterns that felt foreign and imposed, rather than natural and spontaneous. What followed was a brief but disturbing accounting, not of births, genetic corrections, or successful breeding outcomes, but rather of increasingly obvious anomalies in the household's daily functioning. The writer described the physical house as somehow shrinking around its inhabitants, not in terms of actual architectural dimensions, but rather in terms of its functional capacity to contain normal human life. Rooms that had previously served specific domestic purposes were being systematically repurposed for unclear activities. Major hallways were being permanently sealed with furniture and debris, and mirrors that had been absent from the house for decades were suddenly reappearing in locations where windows had previously provided views of the outside world. According to this account, the attic level no longer contained the beds that had been documented in earlier entries, but had instead been converted to hold what the writer cryptically described as watches. The entries continued with mentions of family members or individuals who claimed to be family members, displaying increasingly disturbing behavioral abnormalities. One figure was described as walking through the house without ever bending his knees during locomotion. Another individual appeared to be copying the writer's speech patterns and vocal inflections before the original words had actually been spoken. As these observations accumulated, the tone of the writing shifted noticeably from curiosity and confusion toward genuine dread and psychological distress. The writer admitted to experiencing episodes of sleepwalking, though these nocturnal wanderings did not lead outside the house, but rather into interior rooms that the writer believed had been locked and sealed for decades. One particularly disturbing note simply read, "I woke inside the wall." No additional context or explanation was provided for this statement, leaving researchers to speculate about whether this represented a literal physical experience or some form of psychological metaphor for the writer's growing sense of entrapment. The clinical biological language that had characterized earlier entries, with their detailed notations of breeding schedules and genetic refinements, was notably absent from this section of the journal. Instead, the writer focused intensively on gesture, repetition, and increasingly sophisticated imitation behaviors displayed by the other household members. A growing awareness emerged that those individuals living around the writer were no longer simply close relatives, sharing similar genetic traits, but had instead become what could only be described as echoes or reflections of previous family members. The writer stated that one figure consistently wore identical clothing, perfectly mimicked a distinctive limp, and maintained prolonged silent smiles that seemed to extend far beyond any normal emotional expression. Another household member was observed carrying what appeared to be a duplicate version of the journal itself, though closer examination revealed that its pages were completely blank, suggesting that the act of recording information had become more important than the actual content being preserved. These entries strongly suggested that traditional family roles were no longer being passed down from generation to generation, voices being projected through a single collective mouth. The central fear expressed by this anonymous writer seemed to focus not on death or physical harm, but rather on what could only be described as personal dilution or identity dissolution. The family bloodline, once so singular in its aim and unified in its purpose, appeared to have folded too far inward on itself, creating a situation where individual identity was being systematically erased through excessive genetic and behavioral similarity. One sentence that was repeated multiple times across different pages read like a desperate prayer: "They are pure, but they are wrong." This phrase suggested that while the family's breeding program had indeed achieved its stated goal of genetic purification, the results were fundamentally incompatible with continued human existence. At the bottom of this crucial entry, scratched so faintly into the paper that it required infrared enhancement technology to decipher properly, was a final note that simply stated, "Do not let them learn the outside." The word "them" had been circled with obvious emphasis, though no explanation was provided for who this pronoun was meant to represent, or what knowledge of the outside world might represent such a significant threat. Later journal entries attempted to return to the structured format and clinical tone that had characterized the earlier decades of documentation. Birth logs resumed, posture assessments continued, and anatomical diagrams reappeared with the same reversed orientation and precise measurements. However, the handwriting behind these resumed entries was noticeably different from both the earlier clinical documentation and the confused personal observations of the last clean one. The new script was sharper, more mechanically uniform, and completely lacking in the subtle variations and imperfections that typically characterize individual human handwriting. Whether the uncertain voice of the last clean one had continued writing these later entries, or whether another individual had taken physical possession of the journal entirely, remained unclear to researchers who attempted to analyze the handwriting transitions. One particularly disturbing theory proposed by linguistic specialists familiar with the journal's complex mirrored script system suggested that this final broken voice may have been attempting to write in standard left-to-right format, but had proven psychologically unable to complete the transition from the reverse system that had been programmed into them from birth. Individuals' cognitive structure to allow for normal communication with the outside world. The mental reversal had become too complete, too fundamental to the person's basic thought processes. In attempting to break free from the reversed system, the writer's mind had essentially split between two incompatible modes of processing reality. Only a few words on the page immediately following this entry remained legible after decades of deterioration. These fragments were written neither in conventional forward direction nor in the characteristic reversed script of the family's private system. Instead, they appeared as simply a set of irregular lines scratched into the paper with uneven pressure and no consistent orientation. Their meaning, if any coherent meaning had ever been intended, remained completely undeciphered despite extensive analysis by cryptographers and linguistic specialists. However, among those researchers, scholars, archivists, and even several anonymous clergy members who had been granted access to study the journal's contents over the decades, there existed a remarkable consensus on one critical point. This final, uncertain voice had not been silenced through physical force, coercion, or external intervention. Instead, based on the evidence contained within the journal itself, it appeared that this last independent consciousness had been systematically absorbed back into the collective family identity, dissolved through some process that left no trace of individual resistance or struggle. While the primary text of the journal methodically charted births, language development, and lineage preservation across 4 decades, it was in the margins of these pages, those quiet spaces beside the main blood-written doctrine, where the most disturbing evidence of the family's systematic degeneration had accumulated over time. Dozens of individual pages, many torn at the edges or deeply creased along fold lines, contained faint anatomical sketches that had never been formally titled, directly referenced in the main text, or officially integrated into the family's documented breeding program. However, these marginal drawings reappeared with disturbing regularity throughout the chronological sequence, suggesting they represented an ongoing parallel documentation system. The sketches consisted of detailed outlines depicting human heads, torsos, spines, and limbs, all drawn in ink so faded that archivists initially mistook many of them for age stains or accidental damage to the paper. Only when the pages were examined under enhanced filtered lighting did the true extent and precision of these anatomical studies become apparent. Initially, the diagrams appeared to follow clinical medical standards and objective scientific methodology. Precise measurements flanked each individual sketch, documenting shoulder width, skull circumference, arm length, and total number of visible teeth. Accompanying notes provided brief, clipped assessments such as, quote, torso compressed, digits unequal, or spinal curvature increasing progressively. These marginal annotations were clearly not the idle artistic exercises of children or amateur anatomical studies. Instead, they followed a rigorous methodological approach, systematically observed developmental trends across multiple generations, and carefully compared physical characteristics between different family members over extended time periods. Some entries carried sequential identification numbers, strongly suggesting that the human figures depicted in these sketches were being systematically cataloged and tracked like livestock breeding records across multiple generations. The clinical detachment and systematic approach suggested a scientific breeding program that extended far beyond simple genealogical record-keeping. Over the course of 4 decades represented in the journal, certain disturbing patterns began to emerge from these accumulated marginal sketches. The craniums depicted in successive drawings showed measurable narrowing from one generation to the next. Mandible structures gradually receded in size and prominence. Nasal passages became progressively flatter and less defined. In the later chronological sketches, ear structures disappeared entirely from the anatomical drawings. One particularly disturbing figure was marked with a circled annotation reading, "Birth with no external shell." Another sketch, apparently depicting a female subject, was labeled, "No hip flare. Development. Recheck in 6 months." These clinical observations were recorded with the same detached methodology that might be used to evaluate agricultural breeding stock. Human hands appeared frequently throughout these marginal studies, invariably drawn in detailed profile view. The earliest drawings showed normal 5-finger hands, with careful annotations documenting nail curvature patterns and thumb span measurements. However, over time, the number of digits systematically diminished in the sketches. Later drawings showed hands with 4 fingers, then 3, then eventually even fewer functional digits. One particularly disturbing anatomical study, bearing a date that had been partially obscured by water damage, depicted a hand where the individual fingers had not separated during embryonic development at all. Instead, the drawing showed a single paddle-like appendage marked with the clinical note, "Smooth digital fusion, no individual separation." Significantly, none of these documented physical abnormalities were framed as tragic circumstances, medical emergencies, or causes for alarm or concern. There was no suggestion of pity, remorse, or emotional distress in any of the accompanying notes. Instead, the tone remained consistently evaluative, indifferent, and in many cases apparently proud of the systematic changes being documented. In one sketch depicting a child's back with exaggerated spinal ridge development, the accompanying text read, "Maintained proper form, no postural drooping, excellent spine development." This suggested that severe spinal deformities were being actively encouraged and celebrated as positive breeding outcomes, rather than recognized as serious medical conditions requiring treatment. Later entries contained entire columns of documented genetic defects listed without any emotional context or individual identification. Terms such as cleft development, fused ocular structures, missing arch formation, restricted breathing capacity, and absent tongue development were cataloged like inventory items rather than human medical conditions. These abnormalities were never assigned to specific names or individuals. No one was marked as deceased due to these conditions, and the defects were simply noted and recorded as if human flesh were clay being systematically shaped and evaluated for fitness, according to some predetermined standard of perfection. The concept of breeding correction had clearly evolved beyond theoretical doctrine and had become the family bloodline was not naturally evolving or adapting to environmental pressures. Instead, it was being deliberately sculpted downward through successive generations, with each new birth representing another step toward some ultimate goal that was never explicitly defined. In one folded page that had been carefully tucked beneath the journal's leather binding and was discovered only during professional restoration work, a complete full-body anatomical diagram spanned 2 narrow sheets of paper. The figure depicted was completely hairless, showed no clear sexual characteristics, and was positioned in an unnaturally backward arch that seemed to defy normal human skeletal limitations. The arms in this drawing appeared disproportionately long, extending below the knee level when the figure was standing upright. There were no visible ears on the head, and the eyes were drawn unusually wide and sunken, with no pupils or iris details marked within the eye sockets. Beneath this disturbing figure, a line of mirrored script read, "Remain still and quiet. No extraneous characteristics." One former museum curator who requested complete anonymity claimed to have discovered a second hidden image pressed faintly into the paper grain beneath the primary anatomical drawing. Using forensic heat enhancement techniques, he revealed what appeared to be a nearly identical figure drawn in the same position. However, in this secondary image, only the facial expression had been altered. The hidden figure was depicted with a clear smile, the head was drawn smaller in proportion to the body, and most disturbing of all, the entire face appeared to have been drawn twice in slightly different positions, creating an unsettling double exposure effect that suggested motion or duplication. In 1961, when the sealed Pine Hollow house was briefly entered by state investigating authorities, several bed frames were found to be fitted with wooden components that curved unnaturally inward, creating sleeping surfaces where the spine would be forced into a forward bent position, as if the beds had been specifically designed to accommodate bodies that were expected to develop in non-standard configurations. Some mattresses bore permanent indentation patterns that were too shallow to have been created by normal adult bodies, but simultaneously too wide and irregular to have been formed by conventional children's sleeping patterns. Despite extensive searching throughout the property and surrounding grounds, no medical records were ever discovered for any family member, no human bones were recovered from any location, and no formal graves were ever excavated or identified. Yet the detailed anatomical documentation continued across the final pages of the journal, long after the written entries had ceased to maintain any coherent meaning or logical structure. The last legible anatomical image, drawn in pencil across the inside cover of the journal, depicted a human form with no hands, no feet, and no facial features of any kind. The arms were positioned crossed inward against the torso, not in a position suggesting prayer or religious devotion, but rather in what appeared to be physical containment or restraint. Beneath this final disturbing image, a marginal note read, "The shape remains constant. We have only smoothed away the unnecessary noise." When the house at Pine Hollow was forcibly opened by state authorities in 1961, the ground floor and basement levels yielded disappointingly little beyond oppressive silence and decades of accumulated stillness. Dust lay in thick, undisturbed layers over the iron bed frames. Ceramic bowls were arranged in neat rows without any trace of food or recent use, and the child's chair remained permanently bolted to the floor beside a stone fireplace that forensic analysis proved had never been used for actual heating or cooking purposes. However, it was the upper level of the house, specifically a narrow north-facing room located at the far end of the attic hallway, that resisted all attempts at entry and presented the investigation team with their most significant challenge. Unlike the other doors throughout the house, which hung loosely on their hinges or stood partially ajar, this particular entrance had been systematically nailed shut from the exterior. 4 heavy iron spikes had been driven through the wooden door frame in a cross pattern, rusted metal brackets were affixed at all 4 corners, and an ancient but still intact padlock hung from a metal plate that had been driven completely through the doorframe itself. Despite extensive searching throughout the property, no keys of any kind were discovered that might open this mysterious lock. Based on the advanced corrosion patterns and the accumulated rust deposits, it appeared that this door had remained sealed for many years, possibly decades before the house was discovered by state surveyors. Later official accounts described the decision to breach this sealed door as reluctant and controversial among the investigation team. None of the investigators involved could later agree on who had actually given the final instruction to proceed with forced entry. One deputy sheriff recalled the moment as unnaturally quiet, so silent that it seemed inappropriate to argue with or question the decision. The ancient padlock was carefully removed using professional tools. The rusted nails were methodically pulled loose one by one, and behind the door, beneath a low ceiling that bowed inward with age and structural stress, investigators discovered a room unlike any other space in the house. 3 beds, positioned much lower to the ground than standard furniture, had been arranged in perfect parallel alignment against the far wall. These sleeping surfaces were considerably smaller than normal adult beds, appearing to be handcrafted rather than commercially manufactured. Their support posts were uneven and irregular, and their frames were unusually narrow, as if they had been specifically designed for bodies that had not developed according to normal human growth expectations. Each bed was equipped with iron fixtures permanently mounted at its corners, and these metal attachments were still connected to short lengths of heavy chain. The chains terminated in worn leather buckles that showed obvious signs of repeated use over extended periods of time. Beneath the middle bed, a large dark stain had bloomed outward from the floorboards, spreading in a perfect semicircular pattern that stopped precisely at the wooden footboard. Laboratory analysis conducted weeks later identified this staining as human blood, that had seeped between the floor cracks and dried into the wood grain over many years of accumulation. Despite extensive searching and careful examination, no human body or skeletal remains were ever discovered in this room. One wall of the confined space had been marked with dozens of vertical slash marks, some appearing shallow and tentative, while others had been carved deep into the wood with considerable force. These cuts formed no recognizable pattern, displayed no obvious numerical sequences or alphabetic letters, but rather represented simple repetitions of violent downward force, applied with something sharp and wielded by increasingly unsteady hands. A second wall bore no markings at all, except for a single piece of rough twine that had been nailed in a crooked diagonal line extending from one corner to the opposite corner. Attached to this improvised clothesline were 5 yellowed paper cards, each bearing a single mirrored letter that had been carefully scrolled in what appeared to be charcoal or ash. When these individual letters were viewed through mirror reflection, they spelled a single word: still. The cards showed evidence of having been handled repeatedly over time, with worn edges and finger smudges, suggesting they had been frequently examined or rearranged. Tucked beneath one of the 3 beds was a folded cloth bundle that had been carefully wrapped and tied with strips of fabric. Inside this package were 2 objects that provided additional disturbing context: a wooden spoon that had been worn down to a smooth nub through extensive use, and a scrap of paper covered in the characteristic mirrored handwriting found throughout the journal. The paper fragment bore the date 1955 written in conventional numerals. The message, when translated through mirror reflection, read, "The third is not like them. The third speaks without sound." This cryptic statement suggested that one of the 3 individuals who had occupied this sealed room had somehow differed from the others in ways that were considered significant enough to document. Investigating officials noted that the room had been constructed with no insulation, no ventilation system, and no source of natural light beyond a single window. This window had been completely boarded from the interior, and one of the wooden boards showed scratch marks along its lower half, spaced with regular rhythm and positioned too low for an adult hand, but too deliberately placed to have been created by rodents or other animals. The glass beneath the wooden boards was found to be intact, but had been clouded from the interior side with a thick, organic film. The opacity appeared to have resulted from someone pressing against the glass surface repeatedly over time, until skin oil and condensation had built up to create a permanent fog effect. No clear handprints remained visible in this accumulated residue, only the diffused pressure patterns of repetitive contact that suggested someone had pressed against this window day after day, perhaps for years, until the surface began to fog with the accumulated oils and moisture from human skin. There was no clear indication of how long the children, if children they were, had remained. No names had been assigned to the individual beds, no personal belongings were discovered, and no voices or sounds had ever been reported by neighbors who lived in the general area. Yet one entry from the main journal, dated 2 years before the official discovery of the house, suggested a specific purpose for this locked and isolated space. The relevant passage read simply, "We hold what diverges from the pattern." The floorboards beneath the large bloodstain were eventually removed for comprehensive forensic examination. A shallow cavity was discovered in the subfloor, completely empty except for 3 strands of human hair that had been coiled neatly together and knotted at one end with obvious deliberation. The hair was dark in color, clearly human in origin, and when subjected to advanced DNA testing decades later, revealed mitochondrial genetic markers that were completely inconsistent with the known lineage of the Pine Hollow household. The genetic profile did not match any of the other biological samples that had been recovered from the journal pages, the blood-stained walls, or the bedding materials found throughout the house. In fact, the DNA signature matched no known individual in any available database, suggesting that whoever had contributed this hair sample was not related to the documented family line in any traceable way. Somewhere within the restraints, slashed walls, and sealed window of that confined room, something else had lived, however briefly. Something that was not part of the systematic bloodline purification program. Based on all available evidence, It appeared that the family had made systematic efforts to correct this deviation from their carefully maintained genetic pattern through methods that remained deliberately undocumented in the journal's main entries. The final entries in the blood-written journal differed dramatically in tone, pressure, and obvious intent from everything that had come before. Where earlier pages had been densely crowded with mirrored doctrines, careful measurements, and detailed records of bone structure, blood composition, and symmetrical development, these concluding passages were sparse, brittle, and visibly strained by some form of psychological or physical distress. The ink appeared faint and rushed in some sections while remaining thick and deliberately applied in others, as though the writer had begun too late to document critical information and was attempting to record everything with hands that were no longer steady or reliable. The identity of whoever composed these final thoughts remained unclear, as the handwriting did not match any of the earlier generational contributors to the journal. The characteristic flourishes and decorative elements were completely absent, and the individual lines slanted sharply downward across each page, as if being pulled by some invisible weight. The monogram that had been used consistently throughout the family's documented lineage, the distinctive double L symbol, appeared in these final sections only once, scratched weakly into the lower corner of a page like an afterthought rather than a signature of authority. The first of these concluding passages began with a simple, unexplained declaration. It has turned inward upon itself. No elaboration or context was provided, just this statement floating alone on the page, followed by a noticeable gap in the text, as if the writer had paused, perhaps hoping that the ink itself might provide some form of response or guidance. Later lines suggested a growing awareness that the doctrine of genetic purity that had been upheld for over 4 decades within the walls of Pine Hollow had entered what could only be described as a terminal phase of development. According to these observations, the children no longer required instruction or guidance to maintain the established behavioral patterns, not because they had become rebellious or resistant to authority, but rather because they had somehow become the living embodiment of the doctrine itself. The traditional structure of knowledge inheritance had completely collapsed into a state of simultaneity, where past, present, and future generations existed without meaningful distinction. Traditional roles were no longer being passed down through time from parent to child, but were instead being shared, mirrored, and recycled among all household members simultaneously. One particularly disturbing note stated, "They do not ask where they came from. They ask where I went." The clear implication was not one of childhood rebellion or natural curiosity, but rather of systematic erasure. The final adult authority figure, if such a distinction could still be meaningfully applied, was no longer regarded as a separate individual with independent thoughts and experiences. Instead, this person had become simply a failed or incomplete version of something that had already corrected itself through the systematic breeding program. The children did not see this individual as a parent, teacher, or guide, but rather as an obsolete prototype that had been superseded by more refined and perfected versions. A second entry, written hastily across the margin of what appeared to be a blank page, read, "They know my thoughts before I write them down. They smile when I fail to complete a sentence." This line ended abruptly in mid-stroke, as if the writer had been interrupted, or had suddenly lost the ability to continue forming letters. From this point forward, the journal became increasingly fragmented and incoherent. Individual pages were left unnumbered. Some sections were covered entirely in repeated words that formed meaningless patterns, and others contained nothing but ink blots that had been allowed to spread across the paper without drying properly. One complete page was filled from top to bottom, with backward rows of the letter M, repeated in various sizes and orientations. Across the top of this page, a mirrored phrase had been written, "One will not blend with the others." The meaning of this statement, like so much in these final entries, remained cryptographically opaque. However, it was the final complete page that marked the journal's true closure, not with ritual or ceremony, but with what could only be interpreted as a desperate warning to anyone who might eventually discover these materials. The page began with a methodical list, each line beginning with the imperative word "seal." The instructions were clear and systematic. Seal the pantry, seal the stairwell, seal the attic floor. Then the commands became more abstract and comprehensive. Seal the names, seal the memory, seal the blood. Finally, the ultimate instruction: seal the house. Let it be the grave. No one must survive the ruin. This final sentence had been underlined 3 separate times, with such force that the final stroke cut completely through the bottom margin and scored the leather binding itself. The intensity and desperation were unmistakable. State authorities who conducted the systematic examination of the house in 1961 discovered that many of these sealing commands had indeed been carried out with methodical precision. Rooms throughout the structure had been permanently nailed shut. Major hallways were completely blocked by deliberately collapsed furniture, and the pantry had been filled not with preserved food but with carefully arranged stones. All mirrors throughout the house had been either removed entirely or covered with blackening pitch, and even the small stone fireplace had been stuffed completely full with dried hay and cloth, making it impossible to use for heating or cooking. Only the main front door had been left untouched, presumably left accessible, so that the house would eventually be discovered by outside authorities. A final phrase, discovered scratched into the interior wall of a small closet, seemed to echo this intentional exposure. The message had not been written with ink, but rather carved directly into the wood using some sharp implement. The letters were reversed and crudely formed, but still decipherable when viewed in a mirror. We could not be buried, so we became the house. When the house was finally opened by investigators, no human remains were discovered anywhere within the structure. However, traces of human blood were present in every single room, ranging from very old stains that had darkened with age to some deposits that appeared relatively recent. One particularly notable bloodstain extended in a long smear from the base of the attic door down to the lower stairwell, but this trail stopped abruptly in the middle of the passage, with no footprints or other marks to indicate what might have caused the bleeding or where the injured person might have gone. Whether the final anonymous writer had succeeded in sealing the systematic ruin of the bloodline remained unknown to investigators, but by the time the house was rediscovered by state surveyors, it had already been completely forgotten by the world beyond its boundaries. The structure existed in a state of deliberate concealment, hidden as if it had collapsed inward not just structurally, but genealogically as well. If any of the systematically bred children had somehow survived the family's final phase, they had chosen not to leave the confines of their isolated world. Instead, all evidence suggested that they had remained within the sealed house, waiting in patient silence for whatever conclusion their decades of careful breeding had been designed to achieve. When the journal was finally extracted from its hidden cavity within the Pine Hollow house, it was immediately handed over not to press representatives or public record keepers, but rather to the Kentucky State Archives under strict temporary custody arrangements. The officials directly involved in handling these materials were instructed, through unofficial channels, to speak of the Cresta discovery only in the most vague and general terms. Acceptable descriptions included phrases such as, quote, anomalous genealogical document, sensitive historical material, or unresolved property evidence. However, internally among the archival staff and investigating agencies, the journal quickly became known by a different designation entirely, Object 012. Although there had been significant initial interest in conducting a complete professional transcription of the journal's contents, this process was abruptly halted after just 4 weeks of preliminary review. 3 experienced archivists and 1 forensic linguist who had been assigned to the project each submitted internal memoranda to their supervisors, flagging the document's contents as, quote, non-narrative, ethically volatile, and psychologically corrosive to work with on a daily basis. The journal simply did not fit into any of the existing archival categories that had been established for historical documents. It was neither a conventional historical ledger, a standard medical record, nor a private diary in any recognizable sense. Instead, it appeared to represent something entirely different, a closed system of thought and belief that operated according to its own internal laws and logic, completely disconnected from normal human experience or rational understanding. One senior archival examiner requested immediate psychiatric leave after submitting a report describing recurring dreams of mirrored corridors filled with children who moved without breathing. Another staff member complained of persistent vertigo and disorientation while handling the journal, stating that the reversed script created a sensation of reading myself backward through time. Within a single month of beginning the transcription process, all further work was permanently suspended. A formal petition was submitted to classify the material under Kentucky Medical Ethics Clause 27B, an obscure legal statute that had been originally designed to protect patient records involving extreme mental illness or unauthorized medical procedures. Although this particular law had rarely been invoked since the 1920s, the petition was approved within just 2 days of submission, suggesting that higher authorities were eager to resolve the classification issue as quickly as possible. From that point forward, the journal ceased to exist in any public record or official documentation. The volume was placed in a sealed storage container and assigned a restricted access code under the Department of Health, rather than the conventional archives division. Even its physical location within the state buildings was altered, moved from the general holdings catalog to an unmarked annex that was reserved exclusively for what were euphemistically termed restricted artifacts, many of which had no clear legal origin or official provenance. There was no media coverage of the discovery, no public announcements or press releases, and no academic papers published about the Pine Hollow investigation. The comprehensive field notes from the original House investigation were quietly reduced through systematic redaction, then refiled under completely unrelated property law disputes to obscure their true contents. A single black and white photograph of the journal's exterior cover was known to exist, taken under poor lighting conditions, and never officially circulated among researchers or the public. In this grainy image, the leather binding appeared unnaturally bloated and uneven, as if the contents were somehow putting pressure on the cover from within. A faint stain, possibly wax or some form of organic oil, stretched across the spine of the journal like a darkened vein or root system. What appeared to be a human fingerprint, pressed into the top corner using dried blood, remained partially visible in the photograph, though the image quality was too poor to allow for detailed forensic analysis. In 1971, the sealed journal was briefly reopened under pressure from a university research team that was conducting investigations into hereditary isolation patterns in Appalachian communities. The researchers had specifically requested access to study the Pine Hollow materials as part of a broader academic study of closed populations and genetic bottlenecking effects. However, after reviewing just 17 pages of the journal under controlled conditions, the entire research team withdrew their access request without explanation. One linguistic specialist who had been part of the original team later described the journal's text as self-canceling, claiming that reading too deeply into the reversed script created a disturbing sensation of forgetting what had already been read, as if the information was somehow erasing itself from memory during the reading process. Another researcher who had participated in the brief 1971 review, but who later left the academic project entirely, allegedly described perceiving a shape in the language that he could not adequately explain or describe to colleagues. When pressed by other team members to elaborate on this observation, he simply replied, "It's not a book. It's a behavior." Following these disturbing reports, the journal was immediately resealed and has remained completely inaccessible to researchers ever since. Over the following decades, the original Pine Hollow property was listed and delisted from county tax rolls multiple times, often due to administrative confusion over legal ownership, current habitability, and property boundaries. Satellite imaging conducted periodically over the years showed no visible structural changes to the house or surrounding buildings, no evidence of collapse or deterioration, and no signs of current human habitation. The house remained standing in its original location, though increasingly overgrown with vegetation and completely unvisited by local residents or county officials. In 1996, the Pine Hollow property was removed from all state records entirely, effectively erasing it from official existence. To this day, there is no record of the family's surname in Kentucky's comprehensive genealogical index systems. The historical census entries have been archived but remain heavily redacted, with no individual first names preserved, and only partial initial letters remaining visible. Even these abbreviated markings appear to shift and change between different documents, as if the family lineage had begun to systematically recede not just from public records, but from collective memory itself. The last formal mention of the Pine Hollow case appeared in a 1983 Ethics Review panel report, where the journal was referred to only as Subject Text 0. This final official report concluded with a single sentence that was left unsigned by the reviewing committee. Exposure to the material does not educate or inform. It replicates and reproduces itself. When the Pine Hollow homestead was systematically entered by state authorities in 1961, the overwhelming silence within the structure initially suggested complete abandonment by its inhabitants. Yet every detail of the interior arrangement, beds carefully positioned, ceramic bowls neatly stacked, chairs permanently bolted in place, clearly implied that daily life had continued in some form until very recently. Official records from county birth registries indicated that at least 11 children had been born on the property between 1922 and 1959, and census data suggested that at least 6 adults had been present during various time periods, though none were ever specifically identified by name. However, nowhere on the entire property was there any indication that death had ever occurred naturally. No headstones or grave markers were visible anywhere on the grounds, no funeral remnants or burial artifacts were discovered, and no formal cemetery plots had been established in the surrounding area. This complete absence of mortality evidence became one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire investigation. State surveyors began systematic excavation procedures on the third day of their on-site investigation. The land immediately surrounding the house structure appeared uneven and disturbed in some areas, but showed no obvious signs of deliberate burial or grave preparation. There were no recognizable mounds, no wooden markers of any kind, and no surface depressions that might indicate subsurface interment. A nearby clearing located approximately 60 yards west of the main house showed evidence of prolonged exposure to weathering and natural erosion processes. However, despite extensive searching and systematic examination, no tools, clothing fragments, personal belongings, or human remains were discovered anywhere in this area. The excavation teams found only exposed rock formations and root systems, though the roots themselves appeared unusually thick and pale, buried at relatively shallow depths beneath the surface as if they were growing outward and upward, rather than extending deep into the earth, as would be expected in normal forest soil conditions. The initial archaeological strategy involved careful, shallow trenching in grid patterns around the house foundation. However, shovel strikes met immediate resistance almost everywhere they dug. Dense limestone formations near the surface were interwoven with twisted root networks that coiled like organic cables beneath what appeared to be old wounds in the earth. Nothing yielded conventional archaeological evidence. No bone fragments, no ceramic artifacts, no ash deposits from cremation, and no metal objects that might indicate burial practices. A comprehensive ground-penetrating radar scan conducted years later revealed similar puzzling results. The subsurface geology was described as a, quote, anomalous by the consulting geologist. Rather than displaying the normal horizontal stratification expected in undisturbed soil, the underground layers appeared to be arranged in a spiral pattern, where stone formations curved around patches of dry earth in funnel-like configurations. The geological consultant described the subsurface structure as resembling not a conventional graveyard, but rather some form of natural or artificial seal. Yet, the historical records were absolutely clear and consistent. Births had definitely occurred on the property across multiple decades. Several journal entries explicitly referred to disposals, excisions, and returnings of individuals who had apparently been deemed unsuitable for the family's breeding program. One particularly cryptic passage from 1942 stated, "2 born this season, 1 folded back, properly buried back into the form." No clear indication was provided regarding what the form was intended to represent, whether it referred to a physical location, a ritual process, or something else entirely. By 1945, similar terminology appeared again in the journal, returned into the root system. This suggested that whatever burial or disposal practices the family employed, they involved some form of integration with the natural environment rather than conventional interment in marked graves. One investigating officer recalled a specific moment during the excavation process when a sapling tree, no taller than an average boy's shoulder, was carefully removed to allow for further digging in a promising area. The young tree came free from the soil with unnatural ease, suggesting that its root system had not developed the deep anchoring structure that would normally be expected. When the root ball was examined, rather than displaying the typical central taproot with smaller lateral branches, the entire system consisted of offshooting tendrils that were coiled in mirrored symmetry around a hollow central space. At the very base of this unusual root formation, beneath the loosened soil, they discovered something small, round, and polished that resembled organic bone material. The object was too small and thin to be a normal human bone, and it bore no teeth or other identifying characteristics that might allow for species identification. However, rather than sending this potentially crucial evidence to a laboratory for comprehensive analysis, the decision was made to halt all excavation immediately. The site was quietly reclassified by state authorities, changed from an active archaeological investigation to a preservation zone due to concerns about, quote, cultural sensitivity and structural instability. All soil removal operations were permanently halted, and a formal memo was filed, stating that further excavation might compromise the historical integrity of the site. The cleared area was deliberately left untouched, and the surrounding forest growth was actively encouraged to regrow and reclaim the disturbed ground. This decision effectively ended any possibility of discovering what had happened to the individuals who had lived and died at Pine Hollow over the course of 4 decades. Decades later, a professional naturalist who was conducting wildlife surveys in the region noted that no animals of any kind, neither small rodents nor birds, established nests or permanent territories within a 40-yard radius of the Pine Hollow property. Despite the apparent richness of the soil and the abundance of visible root systems, the area seemed to be avoided by all forms of wildlife. The soil itself, although visibly rich with organic root networks, yielded no earthworms, no beetles, no grubs, and no other signs of the decomposer organisms that normally inhabit healthy forest floor ecosystems. Leaves that fell from the canopy above would drop and dry naturally, but they never decomposed or broke down into organic matter. Instead, these fallen leaves simply remained year after year, forming an ever-thickening brittle carpet over ground that seemed to actively resist all natural processes of change and renewal. What remained most disturbing about the excavation results was not what had been found beneath the Pine Hollow property, but rather what had not been discovered. In every documented case of rural family lineage across Appalachian counties during the same historical decades, at least one burial plot, whether formally marked or completely unmarked, could be located somewhere on the family property. Traditional family graves, stone circles, primitive cairns, or other memorial markers were standard features of isolated homesteads throughout the region. At Pine Hollow, despite decades of continuous habitation in complete isolation, and despite clear documentary evidence of multiple births and at least some deaths over a 40-year period, the family had left absolutely no evidence of mortality or burial practices. There were no graves, no memorial markers, and no indication that death had ever been acknowledged as a natural part of the family's life cycle. This created only 3 possible explanations for the missing remains. Either the bodies had been transported to distant locations for burial, they had been completely destroyed through cremation or other means, or they had never been buried at all but had somehow been integrated into the land itself through processes that left no conventional archaeological trace. A rare unofficial journal entry from a county maintenance worker who had visited the site in 1978 offered one final disturbing possibility that had not been seriously considered by the official investigation teams. He described discovering dozens of wildflowers blooming in dense clusters around the western edge of the house, in an area where no seeds had been planted and where no direct sunlight ever reached the ground due to heavy tree coverage. The flowers, according to his account, were an unusual pale color that he had never seen in any local flora. In his personal notes, he wrote that the petals were the exact pale tone of infant gums just before the first teeth emerge. This observation was so unsettling that he never returned to the Pine Hollow property and never filed an official report about his discovery. No forensic evidence of human remains was ever recovered from the soil at Pine Hollow, and yet the ground itself seemed to pulse with some form of organic presence that defied conventional understanding. The earth felt simultaneously empty and unnaturally full, as if it were holding secrets that it would never willingly reveal to outside investigation. In the decades following the official suppression of the Pine Hollow Journal, its contents remained almost entirely inaccessible to researchers, restricted under medical ethics statutes, and housed in a sealed archival facility. However, the limited fragments that circulated among forensic anthropologists and linguistic theorists, carefully paraphrased and heavily redacted for legal protection, began to form the foundation of a disturbing new hypothesis in the study of isolated human populations. This theoretical framework would eventually be known among academic specialists as the, quote, mirror generation theory, though it was never formally published or subjected to peer review due to the sensitive nature of the source materials. At its core, the mirror generation theory proposed that the Pine Hollow family had somehow ceased to evolve biologically in any conventional sense after the second generation of systematic inbreeding. Through deliberate and methodical reproductive isolation maintained over 4 complete decades, the genetic diversity within the family had narrowed to such a critical point that rather than resulting in the typical collapse expected in closed populations, it had instead produced an eerie form of biological repetition that seemed to operate outside normal evolutionary processes. The initial evidence for this theory was primarily anatomical and physical. Birth records and journal entries noted recurring physical traits appearing consistently across multiple decades: fused digits, distinctively bowed, spinal formations, mirrored dental patterns, and recurring earlobe detachment patterns that appeared generation after generation with mechanical regularity. However, it was not until the Pine Hollow Journal was partially transcribed in 2001 by a linguistics consortium working from unauthorized photographic scans that the behavioral repetition aspects of the theory became apparent. Phrases that had initially been believed to represent unique personal reflections, individual thoughts, private observations, and even prayer-like expressions were discovered to recur verbatim across journal entries that had been written 20 or 30 years apart. These repeated phrases were clearly not copied from earlier entries, as the handwriting analysis conducted under forensic conditions revealed that each entry had been written by distinctly different individuals. However, when the handwriting was examined in detail, the structural characteristics, the angle of letter descent, the pressure curves applied to specific pen strokes, the decorative flourishes added to capital letters, each matched their chronological predecessors with a precision that no known human hand can replicate through conscious effort. One forensic analyst, writing in an internal memorandum that was never officially circulated, described the effect as watching a second voice spontaneously remember what the first voice had forgotten, without references to bowing at interior doorways, sleeping without blankets or coverings, and refusing to speak aloud before dusk appeared consistently across multiple decades of entries. These behavioral customs were never explained or justified anywhere in the journal text. They were simply reintroduced again and again, as though they were being instinctively recovered, like muscle memory that had been passed not through teaching and learning, but through blood and genetic inheritance. A fragment from what researchers believe to be the journal's middle chronological section, dating to approximately the 1940s, offered one of the clearest expressions of this phenomenon. We do not name them according to our preferences. The name arrives within them. The chilling implication was that children born into the Pine Hollow bloodline were not receiving names chosen by their parents or other family members, but were instead somehow becoming predetermined names that already existed within the family's genetic and spiritual structure. Individual identity was not being developed through normal childhood growth and socialization, but was rather being reproduced through some process that transcended normal biological inheritance. One journal entry noted the birth of a child described only as M, followed by the disturbing observation, "He recognized the secret knock before anyone taught it to him." Researchers began systematically mapping these recurring patterns of identity and behavior across the available journal fragments. A total of 8 different initials were consistently used throughout all documented entries, spanning nearly 4 decades. Significantly, no new initials appeared in the records after 1932, and each of the 8 established identity markers reappeared in nearly identical behavioral sequences every 9 to 11 years with mechanical regularity. This pattern suggested not merely naming repetition, but complete functional replication of specific roles within the household structure. The roles of caretaker, recorder, child, and corrector seemed to cycle through the generations with no apparent deviation, as if the family was not actually producing new individuals, but rather cycling through predetermined positions that had been established decades earlier. One particularly disturbing theory advanced by a researcher who later withdrew from the project entirely suggested that the Pine Hollow family had not been living within normal generational time at all, but rather within some form of temporal loop where linear progression had been replaced by circular repetition. From this perspective, time was not moving forward for the family members in any case. Each generation was simply a reflection of the previous one, made incrementally more perfect through the systematic elimination of individual variance and deviation. Physical traits that differed from the established pattern were systematically culled, behavioral words or actions that represented change were systematically erased, and only the core mirrored pattern was allowed to persist and reproduce itself. Behavioral surveillance footage that was allegedly captured during a covert 1974 observation of the still-standing Pine Hollow house, though since lost or destroyed, reportedly showed a human figure moving past an upper-story window at exactly 4:03 p.m., following the same precise arc of movement every single. The footage was deemed inconclusive by reviewing authorities, and the Fenn family was presumed to be no longer present on the property, but, if real, the recorded movement suggested behavioral conditioning that continued to operate even after the individuals who had originally established the patterns were no longer alive to maintain them. Later theoretical analyses proposed something even more fundamentally disturbing, that the repetition documented at Pine Hollow might not have been entirely biological or genetic in nature. Somewhere within the systematic narrowing of physical bodies, the deliberate stripping away of individual language, and the methodical sealing off of external memory, the Pine Hollow bloodline appeared to have discovered a method of transmitting complete identity, not forward through time and normal inheritance, but sideways through some process that defied conventional understanding. According to this theory, each child was not actually born as a new individual, but rather re-entered the world as a continuation or repetition of someone who had already existed. The final pages of the journal that remained legible seemed to support this interpretation, containing the same mirrored phrase written in dozens of different variations. "I remember being smaller. I remember being me." However, none of these entries were ever signed with individual names or personal identifiers, because no one within the family structure needed to identify themselves. They already knew exactly who they were, and more disturbing still, who they had always been. In the fall of 2007, a small estate auction was conducted in Laurel County, Kentucky, to liquidate the accumulated belongings of an elderly antiques dealer who had recently died without any living heirs or designated beneficiaries. The auction consisted primarily of unsold items from his personal collection: tarnished tin toys, water-damaged books with cracked spines, and rusted hand tools with mismatched wooden handles that bore the wear patterns of decades of use. Box 34 in the auction catalog was listed as unmarked, unclaimed, and showing significant water damage from years of storage in an unheated basement. The entire lot was sold to a local elementary school teacher for the minimal bid of $8. The contents appeared unremarkable at first examination: a child's slate writing board, a length of hand-braided twine that had darkened with age, and a small notebook bound in rough-stitched cloth. Initially, the notebook appeared to be nothing more than a typical educational primer from the early 20th century. There was no publisher's mark visible anywhere on the cover, no decorative illustrations on the binding, and no student's name written on the inside cover page. The paper was fragile and had yellowed significantly with age, but every page was filled from top to bottom with text written in mirrored script using what appeared to be a child's hand. However, the handwriting was so mechanically consistent throughout the entire volume that it appeared to have been produced by some form of printing press rather than human effort. There were no individual titles, no corrections or crossouts, no dates or chronological markers anywhere in the text, only recurring sets of initials, L, M, R, paired in endless variations and combinations across the margins of every page. Occasionally, between blocks of text, small drawn symbols would appear, a circle divided by a line, a comb-like pattern, or the outline of a hand missing several fingers. These images were rendered with the same mechanical precision as the handwriting, showing no evidence of artistic development or personal creative expression. Linguistic analysis conducted months later by a private collector who had purchased the notebook from the schoolteacher confirmed that the writing system followed exactly the same mirrored syntax and structural patterns that had been documented in the suppressed Pine Hollow Journal. However, this secondary notebook was clearly not an official ledger, breeding record, or continuation of doctrinal instruction. Instead, it appeared to be intensely personal, reflective, and quietly disturbed by the circumstances it described. The voice that emerged from these reversed pages seemed considerably younger than the authoritative tones found in the original journal, and the overall emotional character was more fragmented, confused, and psychologically unstable. Several entries began with variations of a single phrase that appeared again and again throughout the volume. Today I forgot which one I am. Other passages describe small ritualistic behaviors, such as tracing geometric lines in accumulated dust using bare feet, or walking through interior spaces while counting each step to ensure that only even numbers were used. There were references to the others throughout the notebook, but these individuals were never described directly or identified by name. Instead, they were mentioned only through indirect and increasingly paranoid observations. The one who walks exactly like me, and the mouth I don't remember making those sounds. The notebook's most deeply chilling feature was its persistent repetition of a single question that appeared in nearly every entry, rewritten in slightly different forms but always expressing the same fundamental confusion. If I am the new one, why do I remember everything the old one experienced? Toward the final pages of the notebook, the handwriting became progressively tighter and more compressed, with individual lines crowding into margins that were never intended to accommodate text. The spacing between words narrowed dramatically, and entire sentences were pressed into areas of the page that could barely contain them, suggesting some form of mounting psychological pressure or desperation. One entry included a carefully drawn portrait of a human face, rendered without artistic detail but with disturbing precision. The image showed two eyes positioned unusually far apart and a horizontal slit representing a mouth. Underneath this drawing, a phrase was written in reversed script. "He smiles too soon, before anyone speaks." A few lines later on the same page, another observation appeared that provided no context or explanation. "They told me I was born twice, but I can only remember one time." The notebook contained no clarification for this statement, no follow-up questioning, and no attempt to explore what such a claim might mean. The phrase appeared once more on the back cover of the notebook, but this time it had been written in conventional left-to-right orientation rather than the mirrored script that characterized the rest of the volume. This represented the only entry in the entire notebook that had been written in normal, forward-facing direction. Scholars who attempted to trace the provenance and ownership history of this mysterious notebook discovered that no documentation existed for its origins prior to the estate auction. The deceased antique dealer's comprehensive inventory lists made no mention of Box 34 or its contents, and no other items in the estate sale carried dates, signatures, or other identifying information that might provide contextual clues. The cloth binding of the notebook showed distinctive wear patterns when subjected to forensic analysis. The edges had been handled frequently over extended periods, and the physical evidence suggested that the book had been held repeatedly by small hands, based on the spacing and positioning of the most worn areas on the cover. One independent investigator noted that the overall condition and writing quality of the notebook seemed far too sophisticated and practiced to have been created by a single child working in complete isolation. The mirrored script, while consistent with the Pine Hollow Journal's documented examples, appeared more fluid and rehearsed than would be expected from someone learning this unnatural writing system for the first time. Instead, the technical proficiency suggested handwriting that had not been learned through conscious effort but rather inherited through some more fundamental process that bypassed normal educational development. When the notebook was briefly displayed at a private academic symposium in 2009, attendees were explicitly warned not to photograph the pages or attempt to duplicate any of the text, not due to concerns about the physical fragility of the materials, but rather due to what organizers described as precautionary measures. An internal memorandum circulated after the symposium described a linguistic phenomenon that had been observed among several attendees who had spent extended time. These individuals reported experiencing subtle mirror reversal effects in their own note-taking, unconscious misspellings that aligned with backward phonetic patterns, and a persistent sense of temporal dislocation that continued for days after their exposure to the materials. One participant later stated in a confidential interview that reading the notebook had created a disturbing sensation of familiarity, as though she had, quote, already read these exact words before, but in a dream that I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Today, the notebook resides in a climate-controlled storage drawer at an undisclosed archival facility, locked within a light-proof container that prevents any accidental exposure to its contents. It has not been assigned an official catalog number, its pages remain completely untranscribed, and its location is known to fewer than 3 individuals worldwide. Yet even now, decades after its discovery, the notebook's final line continues to circulate in archival rumors and whispered academic discussions. Written once at the bottom of the back page in graphite so faint that it was nearly invisible until enhanced under special lighting, the concluding statement read, "This time I will stay inside and not try to leave." The handwriting of this final entry was examined by forensics specialists and determined to be identical to a